Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, good evening, good night, depending on where you are in the world. Appreciate you for joining this next advisory hour we'll be presenting on migrating from VMware to Microsoft Virtualization platforms. For those of you that haven't attended one of our advisory hours before, we ask that you put your questions in the Q&A panel. You should see that at the top of your screen. And from there, if you type in your questions, we'll get to those as we can. We may try to answer some of those throughout the presentation, but otherwise we'll try to get to all of them by the end. Is there any question with that? Is anybody having any issues with the Q&A panel? If so, go ahead and click the hand raise icon just so we know, or if you're having issues finding it. Perfect. Since I'm sure you're not here to listen to me talk, I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to Scott Campbell. He's one of our enterprise architects who is very knowledgeable in this area. Oop, I see we do have an attendee having an issue with the Q&A panel. If you don't mind, I can go ahead and I'll send you a note on the side. We'll see if we can get this straightened out. All righty, with that being said, I will hand it off to Scott Campbell to go ahead and begin the presentation.
Thank you. Thank you, Heath. Hello, everyone. I'm Scott Campbell. I'm an enterprise architect here at US Cloud, and today we'll talk about Hyper-V, Azure Local, and how to migrate from Broadcom VMware, if that's of interest to you, to one of the virtualization platforms that Microsoft offers. We're going to have some polls throughout the session, and the first poll should pop up here shortly, if not already. Thank you, Eric. And the poll question is, are you aware that Azure Stack HCI has been renamed to Azure Local? And while you're responding to that, I'll move on. Our agenda today is going to focus on motivation for shifting away from VMware, some migration considerations, the migration options that Microsoft provides and US Cloud supports, our migration process, addressing common concerns. We'll also have a case study for Hyper-V. We'll talk about Azure Local, and then at the end, we'll have questions and answers, unless you're providing questions along the way. So, motivation. The recent announcements from Broadcom have shifted sentiment, and those changes are around licensing and the end of perpetual licensing. So this may affect you, and this is probably the main motivator for shifting away from VMware to a Microsoft Virtualization platform. So if you are exploring alternatives, this is where US Cloud can step in and help. We support Microsoft Virtualization Stack, which would include Azure Local, which is formerly, Azure Local, formerly Azure Stack HCI, and the Windows Server Hyper-V. Again, the migration consideration, primary one is probably cost savings due to the end of perpetual licensing, or the shift in licensing that may come as a surprise at the time of renewal. So the alternatives, if you're investigating those, we support, or US Cloud supports, Azure Local and Windows Server Hyper-V, because these are Microsoft native products, platforms, services that integrate with the existing Microsoft infrastructure. They offer flexibility and scalability for existing solutions if you're already familiar with these, or run other Microsoft workloads, Microsoft products, features. the integration with local and Azure Local and Windows Server Hyper-V can be facilitated. What are migration options for us? Again, Azure Local, Microsoft Windows Server Hyper-V. Why Azure Local? If you're interested in running hybrid workloads, such as Azure Virtual Desktop or Azure Kubernetes Service, Azure Local makes sense. It supports these workloads in addition to integration with Azure for disaster recovery, business continuity, also providing centralized management, and it offers flexibility and pay-as-you-go pricing or pay-as-you-go licensing that may benefit you. The Hyper-V option is a cost-effective integration with Windows Server and the other Microsoft Windows Server products. Its feature set is not quite as, well, it's mature, but it's limited to live migration, Hyper-V replica, and offers some good security enhancements. Local does it as well, Azure Local that is. If you have questions about which one's the right platform for you, US Cloud can help determine the ideal platform. We'll assess your business needs and the existing infrastructure, as well as proposed infrastructure, to help support your future business goals. Our migration process is 4 phases, or consists of 4 phases. In the assessment phase, phase 1, we'll analyze the existing infrastructure. We'll inventory current VMware environment. We'll perform a risk assessment to evaluate compatibility with the target platform. This risk assessment will lead us to a gap analysis to identify potential challenges, hurdles, issues, such as application incompatibility or data migration issues. Hopefully there won't be any, but if there are, we can address them in the planning phase, phase 2, developing a migration strategy. In this phase, we'll help identify the target platform based on the assessment findings. We'll plan for resource allocation, network configuration, storage requirements, all the logistical nuances that come along with implementing new hardware or different software. And as part of the planning phase, we'll determine the migration method, because the migration method may be slightly different for Windows Server Hyper-V and slightly different for Azure Local. Phase 3 will be the implementation phase. We'll help you prepare the infrastructure, the storage, networking, and compute. We'll help you set up the target environment and a proof of concept, because we don't want to jump straight into production. We want a proof of concept, the environment, learn along the way. This involves setting up and configuring the virtualization platform and to somewhat initiating a partial migration as part of that proof of concept. The appropriate tools will vary based off the platform we're moving towards, but could be possible migration tools would involve or consist of Microsoft Virtual Machine Converter, System Center Virtual Machine Manager, or Azure Migrate. And as part of the migration planning, we'll help you with the migration validation and the functionality along the way. Phase 4, ongoing support. This is where US Cloud can excel if we didn't shine in the first 3 phases, with post-migration support, helping you address the issues that arise. Will help you set up and configure monitoring to ensure that the environments are stable and that there are no gotchas post-migration. And we'll work to promptly address those issues with your team and collaborate with your team to ensure success.
One
US
quick
Cloud.
question that's come up, Scott, sorry to
Yes, sir.
interrupt you. But when we talk about application compatibility or data migration issues, do you have any examples of those that you've seen? Are there any common kind of gotchas that come up in the gap analysis?
I don't have any specific cases at the moment, or I can't think of any offhand. Typically, incompatibility offhand would be the platform or workload you're running on the virtualization stack. From a vague or target sense, is that supported? Can Hyper-V, Windows Server Hyper-V support that workload? Can Azure Local support that workload? That's offhand the gap analysis that I'm thinking of. Other things that may influence storage, network complexity, security related to networking. It's one of those that will have to be assessed on a per case by case basis. Unfortunately, that's.
All right. Thank you.
Sir. Thank you for the question. US Cloud Consultative Services, proactive support to help you achieve your business goals along the way. So we'll be engaged with you along with our project office, project team to help drive success. And if there's any upskilling required or exposed or comes about as a need or gap, US Cloud offers upskilling through partners. So your hours can be converted into training through a training partner. So common issues as part of any migration, downtime. We want to avoid downtime as much as possible. And unfortunately, there will be some downtime, more than likely. So how do we mitigate that? And that's part of planning. Compatibility issues. We'll hopefully find and address compatibility issues in a proof of concept. And the proof of concept should be a small sample or appropriately sized sample that I don't say replicates, so it's very similar to what your production environment would be like, so that we can find these potential compatibility issues and address them before larger scale migration. There's always a learning curve with implementing something new. So upskilling, knowledge sharing during the proof of concept is important to help you achieve success. We recognize this, and we'll be there to address your questions and concerns. Security. Security in the virtualization environment is important. Storage encryption, BitLocker, role-based access control, delegation of responsibility. These are all security measures that we will guide you through and help you address along the way.
I have a couple more questions if you have a minute,
Yes, sir.
Scott.
Yes, sir.
So Azure Local is essentially Hyper-V, but with additional Azure Cloud Service connectivity and management? Question mark.
Generally, yes. Generally, yes. So Azure Local is an evolution of Windows Server Hyper-V, still uses Hyper-V. The Windows Server operating system is, in some aspects, merely a guest on any virtualization platform, be it VMware, nested virtualization within Hyper-V itself, Azure, Azure Local, Google, AWS, any other virtualization or hosting platform. So essentially it is an evolution of Windows Server Hyper-V. And yes, the feature set for Azure Local has additional capabilities to support Azure Virtual Desktop virtualization. Yes, you can run Hyper-V, Windows Server Hyper-V and desktop virtualization. You can run Kubernetes or container services on Hyper-V, but it may require additional overhead. Azure Kubernetes Service is natively supported on Azure Local. Hope that helps.
Wonderful. If there's any follow-up questions you have, feel free to add that to that. The other question we have, which is probably top of mind for a lot of folks, what about VMware NSX migration? Is there a product we recommend for migrating VMware NSX? How could we help with that migration?
So NSX is part of the VMware Cloud Foundation, and NSX is a network. I'm going to oversimplify it and call it a network virtualization or network security. And for NSX, the best option is not a Microsoft product, and this is my opinion, but going to Azure VMware Solution is probably the best, most compatible thing for NSX.
Would we be able to replicate some of the functionality of NSX within a Microsoft deployment?
Some of it probably through Azure Local, but that's speculation without knowing. My exposure to NSX is limited, but what I understand is the correlation would be through Azure Local. Windows Server Hyper-V doesn't have the feature set, or it doesn't have the feature set for network layer abstraction that Local would provide.
Understood. We could replicate a lot of the same functionality of NSX, but it would take a lot of manual effort and configurations that NSX has simply kind of built in. So
Right, and in that space, while it's not part of the conversation, Azure VMware Solution may be the ideal path in that case, in that topic area, situation scenario. Microsoft would insulate you from Broadcom contract negotiations, but still running VMware, but VMware would run in Azure, and there may be other complexities that you don't want to entertain at that time or in the short term.
So with the second part of that being how would we help with that migration? We could do is we could look at your exact requirements. We could kind of help you come up with a plan, like we were talking about with those earlier phases, about what makes sense for you and your organization. As you've heard on this call, unlike maybe talking to solely VMware or solely Microsoft, they're going to try to point you towards their solutions. We will actually have an open and honest conversation with you about what pieces make sense from each platform and kind of come up with that plan for you. And then we can support the deployment no matter which direction you go. So we can actually support the deployment across the stacks we're talking about here. And it'd be a fun conversation to have, and we'd work together to get it done.
Yep. Thank you, Heath. All right, second poll. Are you impacted by Broadcom's VMware licensing changes? And it's ironic that we're having this conversation today because over the weekend I read that Broadcom announced some changes for their partner space in terms of licensing, and so thank you for all that have responded.
While folks are filling out this poll, we got a actually very relevant conversation when it comes to cost, and that's what is the use case for Azure Local compared to deploying Hyper-V on-prem beyond just simple hardware CapEx cost?
Ooh, that's a good one. So beyond the CapEx cost of the hardware, the functionality, feature set functionality that you're trying to achieve, maintain, is probably the driver. If you're interested in running or testing Kubernetes before shifting to the cloud, Azure Local is probably a good platform, better platform. If you're interested in Azure Virtual Desktop before full-on deployment to Azure Local can give you that testing space, pre-production space to try it out while providing you with the management capabilities. Hyper-V, for its simplicity, may require additional software and services that would need to be provisioned on-prem. And Azure Local, for its cloud integrated capabilities, would allow you to avoid deploying additional software and hardware on-prem to manage and maintain, and that the cloud services Azure offers would allow you that management capability. There are non-cost related aspects to consider, but these are organizational changes. What I'm trying to frame this as best I can, but Hyper-V is, while mature and stable, doesn't offer you a feature set, and Local would provide you with a feature set, and that comes to attracting talent, people, to be innovative and solution finders for the organization that you're working in. If you're constrained by the limits of Hyper-V, innovation will stifle. If you're capable of innovating across cloud platform with Azure Local, you can attract talent and provide services, products, features, things that your business can grow and adapt to. And that's one of the aspects that should be considered in any solution. Oh, you have other questions?
That's all for now.
Thank you. All right, we'll move into the case study for Hyper-V. So, executive summary of the client profile is a healthcare provider with a couple hospitals, clinics nationwide, with the patient-centric care focus. This customer offers a range of medical services, specialized treatment, specialized surgeries, so patient-centric focus. The customer relies heavily on IT infrastructure for records management, telemedicine, administrative operations, basically supporting the business, supporting the enterprise. So this organization started off with VMware, and because of the license changes, looking to see what other options are available. So the customer had a skilled team that was focused on VMware, but they were impacted by VMware's licensing changes. the lack of perpetual or end of perpetual licensing was going to affect them. The customer needed to accommodate for growth. So I'm assuming, I'm reading between the lines here, that the license contract was up for renewal, the hardware needed to be refreshed. So bad timing, potentially. Customer had a need to accommodate growth and scalability. There were also some compliance deadlines that needed to be accomplished within a relatively short time frame of about 6 months. There were capacity issues with the existing infrastructure. And the last item is probably the gotcha is the lack of in-house experience with non-VMware solutions. So like many organizations that have used VMware, you've probably used VMware for close to a decade and you have a wealth of knowledge there. And then how does that bank of knowledge pivot, those people pivot to another virtualization solution? So as part of the solution, US Cloud conducted an assessment of the customer's IT environment, their VMware stack, and we come up with this. So through the process, it was decided to move from VMware or migrate from VMware to Hyper-V, Windows Server Hyper-V, not Azure Local, not Azure Stack HCI, Hyper-V. So the customer could use their existing Windows Server licensing, addressing or potentially reducing costs for additional licensing. They use their existing Windows Server licensing. Hyper-V's compatibility with the Microsoft stack of products the customer is already using made it a better choice, or made it the ideal choice. With Azure and integration with Hyper-V, the integration allowed them to alleviate on-premise capacity issues, still using Windows Server Hyper-V, integrating with Azure, and this hybrid approach helped them meet demand, current demand, allow them to scale for future growth. As part of the phased migration, we developed a strategy, a step-by-step migration plan, prioritizing critical care systems. Part of the exercise of migration, there was a proof of concept along the way. What's not listed here, there was a proof of concept. Migrations were scheduled during off-peak hours and generally resulted in less than 2 hours of downtime per department, per workload. So optimizing the deployment, optimizing the migration to reduce impact, critical. Testing along the way, validating, assuring that the migration would be a success. Proof of concept provided rigorous testing for the applications, optimized for Hyper-V. The proactive assessment, engagement, collaboration, minimized post-migration issues, and helped the customer achieve success.
A couple questions have popped up for us, Scott, if you're okay with that.
Yes, sir.
This one I think we may talk about later, but I'll go ahead and ask it now. Do you typically encourage repurposing existing hardware or migrating to a new on-prem platform if Azure Local is our goal?
Well, that's a great question. So if you're shifting from VMware to Hyper-V, Windows Server Hyper-V, you could probably repurpose the hardware fairly easily. If you have resource constraints and don't have any excess hardware to shift or pivot to, procuring additional hardware will likely be needed at some point. It also depends on the age of the hardware. In terms of Azure Local, Microsoft, I don't say has a tight control over the hardware, but has recommendations on hardware that should be considered and should be, depending on the age of the hardware you're using, may not be supported for Azure Local. Those constraints are not intended to be inhibitors, although they can be. They're intended to provide consistency and consistency across the hardware. And so that if you're clustering Azure Local, nodes or resources can fail over, that there is compatibility with the Azure Local resources and Azure resources. Think about a disaster recovery exercise, business continuity. So there is that aspect that should be considered. And we can help you assess your hardware to validate that it would be or could be supported. But I'm going to make a speculation that likelihood, again, depending on the age of the hardware, it likely would not be supported. But we won't know until we investigate.
All right, another question. When this slide references 2 hours of migration time, does that include the refactoring of workloads from VMware to Hyper-V?
I'm assuming that at some point there were, while I wasn't directly involved in this, I'm assuming at some point that there was a robocopy type exercise of migration. Now the refactoring from VMDK to VHD has to occur. And I'm assuming that that was done in less than 2 hours. I assume copies were made and tested ahead of time and validated. And if there were minimal changes on the VMDK VMware virtual machines, that cutover could occur in less than 2 hours.
Yes,
So,
there was prep work that went on for this one. But the actual downtime that a department would experience was less than 2 hours. So we were able to do a lot of stuff in advance of the actual cutover to minimize that downtime. So there's all things we can talk through. A lot of things come into play there. It's what are you currently running? Do you have redundant systems already? Can we run on a single system if you have a dual redundancy? Because then we can migrate one at a time. All those things come out, and a lot of the refactoring of like configurations and things like that, we're able to take care of in advance. So it is literally a matter of, you know, migrating the VMDK over. And so that way we're minimizing that downtime. So everything we're doing is with minimizing downtime in mind. So we do anything and everything we can in advance of the actual cutover, which is how we're able to get that down below 2 hours per department.
thank you.
Another question we have here. Uh, uh, Bear with me. This is a long one. Um, a lot of companies have had their costs doubled or tripled due to the change to Broadcom. Yes, we know that part. That's one of the things we heard that from some of our customers. That's why we knew that this would be an important session to host. Even with that being the case, sizing a server in the cloud with the specs that you can with on-premise virtualization are very cost prohibitive for most organizations. Do these services we're speaking of help with that cost? We are still on the customer, they're still on prem because even with the increase in cost, moving our service to the cloud would increase our cost anywhere between 8x to 10x to run our workloads. This was confirmed working with Microsoft engineers. If we didn't want this to be the case, we would end up with servers that were way undersized. So we're just trying to figure out with what we're talking about here, obviously, yeah, trying to move some massive virtualization solutions into the cloud can be cost prohibitive. So when we're talking here, how do we kind of use this as a way to keep those costs lower? Because we're talking all on primarily on-prem solutions here, right, Scott?
Correct. While I have mentioned Azure and Azure VMware Solution, we're focused on Azure Local, which runs on hardware on premise, has a connection back to Azure for management, maintenance, management overhead like monitoring, disaster recovery, business continuity. Windows Server Hyper-V runs on-prem on your hardware. So everything that we're talking about is on-prem centric with some connection back to Azure for essentially management.
So it would still be from a costing standpoint, it would be very similar probably to the hardware cost and those kind of management and operational overhead cost of a customer's VMware solution. We're
Correct.
just actually cutting significantly the licensing cost, but we're still keeping it on premise.
Correct. So still CapEx, capital expense for the hardware to run on-prem. Yeah, you're still running your virtual machines on-prem. Depending on the Hyper-V or Azure Local, there's have options. Not advertising, encouraging wholehearted shift or holistic shift to Azure, but the integration's there and should be taken advantage of where possible for at least the management pieces, monitoring, compliance reporting, security, disaster recovery, business continuity, etc.
Perfect. Thank you. That's our questions for now. We've had some great questions today. Keep them coming.
Thank you. So the results of this migration exercise, 35% cost reduction, and that was solely from licensing changes. So the cost of licensing dropped by $700,000. The compliance goals needed to retrofit, upgrade, modernize. The compliance goals were met, and then avoiding, as a result of being met, avoided fines. There was a scalability boost, 50%. This additional capacity allowed for new clinics or new funding for clinics, new reinvestment, basically. Applications performed better. Data retrieval was improved. So quality of life for the staff and application responsibility, application serviceability improved. And that resulted in a 30% efficiency gain. At the time, System Center Virtual Machine Manager was integrated, which helped streamline the management of the resources. So, any questions so far before I move on? All right, so
None yet.
thank you. So here's a comparison of the virtualization stack for VMware Cloud Foundation and Windows Server Hyper-V. And so this is just these two at the moment. So both are type 1 hypervisors. So they sit on top of the hardware, manage the virtualization. Service providers or VMware providers or virtual machine providers, excuse me. Slightly different approaches based off the organizations that provide them. But here's just a little comparison. Azure Local, we'll shift over. So the solution overview for Azure Local is very similar to Hyper-V. This is also type 1 hypervisor. This screenshot was taken from Microsoft documentation. So you know where its source is. There's still Hyper-V The Azure Stack operating system relies on Hyper-V for the virtualization. There's also storage spaces direct. Above the operating system, this is where the workloads would run, and this is where Azure Virtual Desktop and Kubernetes has 2 workloads advertised to be supported on Azure Local. Native support for Azure Local can operate, and then the Azure integration pieces at the top, Entra ID, Azure Backup, Site Recovery, Azure File Sync, Update Manager, the management services that typically or may typically require additional hardware and software are integrated or can be easily integrated with Azure Local. Yes, you can still integrate it with Hyper-V, but may require some additional configurations. This is all natively done through the Azure Local control plane.
So one question that's come up that may be relevant here, is there anything comparable to vSAN to have a full HCI stack with the vSAN scalability and performance? We don't want to return to separate SAN storage. My past experience with Hyper-V was less than great. It seemed crude and far behind in comparison.
Okay, yeah. So Azure Local hardware is a hyperconverged solution. So storage, networking, and compute are included, which would vSAN is the storage for Azure VMware or VMware in general, excuse me, not just Azure VMware. So the storage space is direct. The storage included with the Azure Local OEM hardware would be there. To your point of having storage constraints, I'm not aware of externally attached storage that can be attached to the Azure Local because it's all encompassing in the hardware. So there may be a constraint there. I'm assuming that if you cluster the Azure Local solution for multiple nodes, multiple local nodes, hosts, that your storage needs could be met or achieved. But that's a use case would have to understand what the storage requirements are. Offloading unnecessary storage to other devices, other platforms. If you're running Windows file server, there are options, potentially better options to running a file server locally. And not just in Azure Files, but M365, Teams, SharePoint. So I think those should be considered at some point.
Thanks, Scott. That's our questions for now.
Yes, sir. Thank you. So while we don't have a case study for Azure Local or Azure Stack HCI, we do have some compare and contrast for local versus Windows Server Hyper-V. And the 2 slides coming are centered around this compare and contrast. What does each one provide, contain? So Windows Server, I'm going to start on the right side and cover the Windows Server Hyper-V. So the Windows Server Hyper-V is included as part of the operating system. For Azure Local, the cloud service includes the operating system and more. So Windows Server, additional features would need to be added, which can be done. Windows Server has its own end user license agreement, has its own paid license. Azure Local is covered under your Microsoft customer agreement or subscription agreement. And the billing for Azure Local beyond the hardware. So you'll have to pay for the hardware through the hardware vendor, but the licensing for Azure Local is included in your Azure subscription or Azure bill. Support. US Cloud supports Windows Server Hyper-V and Azure Local. Create tickets with us for support for Windows Server Hyper-V. And create tickets with us for Azure Local, but more than likely support can be performed via your Azure subscription support. Volume License Service Center is where, or the evaluation center is where you're going to get Windows Server Hyper-V. Azure Local, you're going to download it via the Azure portal. And usually there's talking about updates. Well, updates are at the bottom. I'll cover that in a minute. So there are 200 pre-validated solutions, hardware solutions in the Azure Local catalog. So if you're thinking about repurposing hardware, it may be possible if those systems are part of the Azure Local catalog, but the likelihood is they may not be. Windows Server Hyper-V runs on pretty much any hardware that is certified for Windows Server. So simplicity there, wider adoption or implementation possibilities. And there is a sizing tool for Azure Local. A link on the slide will take you to the sizing tool to size your environment. And this is where you can do this on your own. US Cloud can help you with this and help make determinations. And updates and lifecycle policy. Azure Local is always up to date. And with that, Azure Local has to be connected to Azure at least once every 30 days for updates and compliance. You don't have to leave it connected. It can be disconnected, but at some point it has to communicate back to Azure at least once every 30 days. For updates and lifecycle of Windows Server Hyper-V, this is done through the long-term servicing channel, so monthly updates for the platform and environment. So, as I mentioned earlier, Azure Local is a comprehensive hyper-converged infrastructure, virtualization, storage, networking, compute. Windows Server Hyper-V is primarily a virtualization platform. While there is local storage on Hyper-V, it's the storage on the server. Azure Local gives you or provides integration with Azure for those management capabilities, disaster recovery capabilities. Hyper-V also offers some capability of cloud integration, but it's not the same level as Azure Local, and additional services or components may be required. Management. Azure Local gives you the benefit of the Azure integration, infrastructure as code, DevOps, Azure policy, Arc extended security updates, site recovery, backup, etc. Hyper-V is relying on traditional management tools such as Hyper-V Manager, Windows Admin Center, and System Center Virtual Machine Manager, additional components that may need to be installed to support, which may require additional virtual machines or additional hardware. The ideal workloads for Azure Local: Kubernetes, Azure Virtual Desktop, in addition to Windows and Linux virtual machines. Hyper-V is the ideal workload is simply Windows and Linux virtual machines. Azure Local gives us the ability for high availability and disaster recovery with stretch clustering, as well as failover to Azure. Hyper-V has similar capabilities, clustering, migration, and replication, but not quite the feature set that local has. The ideal use case for Azure Local is organizations that are looking to leverage the hybrid cloud capabilities and cultivate integrated infrastructure solutions with cloud services. And if this is not you, then Windows Server Hyper-V is ideal for the simple virtualization needs. And that's not intended to be insulting, or it's just, if you don't need the features, don't buy the features. Windows Server Hyper-V is a more simpler approach for administrators, for system administrators, because it runs on Windows Server. Azure Local is more complicated, can be more complicated with a steeper learning curve. However, the learning curve can be offsets. The learning curve can be offset through gains in the feature set that Local provides. And we can help along the way, again, with that partner training option if we can't address or knowledge share to satisfaction. And our last poll, are you better prepared to implement a Microsoft virtualization platform? And Heath will personally call you if you select yes, let's set up a call. No, I'm not kidding. I don't know that he will, but
I will commit to that.
thank you.
That's not a problem. It's even recorded.
And with that, we are at the end of the presentation. Questions that have not been addressed along the way, happy to field them.
I just see another. Tell you what the question. Yes, we'll be sending out a link to the content, the recording, and so you will be getting that after the session. We'll send that out once we get it uploaded. And I'll share the slide deck with your TAMs, so they'll be able to get that for you. Glad to hear it. I like that question. Excellent presentation. Thank you. I'll take that. Any other questions? Any other answers? Well, ultimately, we do appreciate everybody taking the time. We know everybody's very, very busy. And so taking an hour out of your day to come join us for this, we hope you found value in it. We are working diligently to take feedback we get and improve on these advisory hours with each one. So any feedback you want to send, we would love to hear it. And so that we can continue to get these to the right level to meet your expectations. Before I do a final closing, it looks like we have another question. Just came up in the chat. Are Windows Server Hyper-V licenses very expensive?
Windows Server Hyper-V. So Hyper-V licensing is dependent on the Windows Server license. And that, is it very expensive? That is it's not an easy question to answer. It depends on what your license agreement is and how you're procuring the licenses.
Well, the Hyper-V part of it's pretty cheap because it's an included feature.
That is correct.
It's free.
True, but it's the Windows Server licenses that probably the sticking point for me, that how you're procuring those licenses, what's the rate, what's the discount, that factors into to his
And
point.
what's the edition? Because different editions of Windows Server allow different amounts of Windows Server to be hosted in their Hyper-V, correct?
Correct. Yes, there is the standard data center. Most every organization that would be implementing Hyper-V should be using data center. Not standard, although standard could be used in a limited scale. So yes.
Yeah, last time I checked, Data Center still gives unlimited Windows licenses for anything hosted on it.
Sure, but
So,
it's if it's licensed by core,
yep.
how many cores are in the hardware? How many cores are you licensing in the hardware? So
Yeah.
things that need to be considered.
Yes, but the cost of Hyper-V is honestly zero. It's just whatever license SKU you have for the Windows Server that's running Hyper-V is where your cost will be. So if you look at your Windows Server license cost, um, it's one of the differences between like a VMware and a Microsoft licensing model. VMware, you technically have to pay for every server that's hosted on a VMware box, where with Windows Server, depending on the server edition, there's a number of those licenses that are included. Check our Q&A here. We have a new post in our Q&A. What kind of lead time is needed for a POC? I can go ahead and address that one. So if you submit a ticket, chances are someone will reach out to you within a couple days to get something on the calendar. Our POC lead time is pretty quick to start those conversations, depending on your specific needs and requirements for your proof of concept. That can have an impact on the timing. It's like if you want to do a full POC and all of a sudden acquire a bunch of hardware, how long is it going to take to get the hardware in place, ordered, racked, stacked, and deployed?
Yep. And I will say that if you're considering Azure Local and you're going to implement a cluster with multiple nodes, ordering that hardware in the same purchase order procurement process is advantageous, lest you are provided with slight differences and nuances of the hardware misconfigurations. These are hurdles I have observed through experience from hardware that was purchased in multiple purchase orders or procurement processes. Even though it's standard approved Azure Local, Azure Stack HCI hardware, there are slight differences in the way the vendor provided the hardware that provided
Right.
issues.
All of a sudden, there's a different chip somewhere on the motherboard that's still valid and still meets the specs as named, but it's technically a different piece of hardware.
Correct. Correct.
But so as you've heard us allude to, the first thing to do would be just submit a ticket. You can either submit it yourself or work with your TAM. Just submit a proactive ticket with us that you just want to talk about it some more, get some more details, and see what a POC could look like. And one of our architects will reach out, schedule some time with you. Lead time's usually pretty short to start those conversations these days, and so and we'll take the next steps and just see what makes sense for you. Does anybody have any more questions? I know we're right at time. You asked the perfect amount of questions to get us right to the time, even with us answering them throughout the presentation. So great work on that. All right. Have a great day, everybody. Thank you so much. And we look forward to hearing from you with tickets as well as seeing you on our next advisory hour.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Have a great day.